So please welcome Colin Dean.
Except it went to the very last slide, so give me a moment. Hey, how about another round of applause for Jenny? She is on my team, and I was one of the other developers and largely responsible for a lot of that technical debt over the years. So it was really cool to hear about it for third party. So, hi, I'm Colin. Is my thing working here? There we go. Hi, I'm Colin. I'm a software engineer. I organize lots of conferences. This is my first time ever speaking at a conference, even though I've organized events for almost 15 years. I wear lots of hats. Usually I'm wearing a hat. Unfortunately, I decided not to take it on an airplane. People look at kind of weirdly, people with top hats on airplanes. I don't know, whatever. Yeah, gotta say this, of course. My words are my own, not of my employer, who actually is not mentioned in my slide anywhere, so you kind of already have a little bit of context on that. And do please save your questions. Here's a quick agenda. Talk about an anecdotal thing, as well as what I define code review as, some of the problems that code review solves, and then we'll get into the architectural nitty-gritty. First of all, my experience with code review started as something different. Started with a student newspaper in college, first as a copy editor. I took on layout and eventually picked up a journalism minor and eventually rose to be the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, despite being a computer science major in a sea of English majors at a predominantly English major school. For about 3.5 years, I read everything that went into the newspaper, everything that was fit to print and a whole lot more that wasn't. This is student journalism, you know. Even as editor, nothing that I wrote went into the paper without at least a few other people reading it. Just like every other piece of content, no one was exempt from this proverbial red pen, or in these days, the recent changes feature of your favorite word processor. That review saved us a few times. Sometimes a student writer would just completely wreck a piece that they had been assigned, and we'd have to rewrite it. And just like Git, we would attach our name onto that commit, and sometimes we would just have to do the whole thing all over again because we really needed that piece on that new club that's doing something fun. Sometimes when doing layout, we would use X's as placeholders, and basically say, we need to put something here. Sometimes it wouldn't go over well, and one time a headline that said, pardon my swearing, "What the fuck is this shit?" Made it through prepress, or made it to prepress. My 70-something-year-old prepress operator, who had probably been doing prepress longer than I've been alive, calls me up. Her number shows up on my caller ID, and she says, "Colin, look at A8. You owe me a case of beer." Click. So my work has been the subject of code review all along, even before I got into it professionally. But you know, what really is a code review to me? How many of you are familiar with code review? How many of you have done code reviews? Okay, good. I don't have to go into that detail. This is my definition of it. Code review is the process by which those who maintain software evaluate a proposed change to that code base, regardless of the source of the proposed change. Wikipedia's definition is a little bit more succinct. This concept of a systematic examination of computer source code. This allows for a lot more broader techniques, but the similarity here is bolded. It's an active examination, and that examination must be systematic. You may be familiar with the term peer review, the Weir's book. So aren't they the same? Well, yeah, but I dislike calling them peer reviews, as Weir's and others do, because that puts too much focus on the peer whose work is under review. By calling it code review, we specify in our nomenclature that we are reviewing code and not the person. Moreover, everything is code these days. Architecture, design documents, these all can be expressed in code. You are using things like Chef or Puppet to configure your production systems, right? Maybe. So in that way, Infrastructure is code as well, and you're a typo, a one and an L, or a C and an O away from a tenfold increase in your production costs with no direct benefit to you. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to use 5 words: change, submission, submitter, reviewer, and annotation. These are probably a little bit better expressed in some context. Now, the submitter proposes changes in a submission, which is evaluated by a reviewer who annotates or accepts it. Those of you familiar with Uyghurs probably remember this formality spectrum. Inspection is the most formal, and ad hoc reviews are the least formal. My concept of code review falls pretty squarely right about there, somewhere between team review and pair programming. We'll from time to time allow others or allow some pairs to review their own changes if it's something really small, inconsequential. But our general rule is if you wrote it, you shouldn't review it. That just kind of would be common sense, right? The biggest difference from Uyghur's description is that we don't do formal meetings at the end of the spectrum. It's just not an activity that we do. Our engineering teams have found these to be inefficient at best and excruciatingly painful at worst. Rather, our code reviews are conducted at the reviewer's leisure. I like to do them in the morning because, well, it gets my brain going. And what better way to get your brain going than to look at somebody else's code before going and writing your own? We use GitHub internally for a lot of our newer projects. I'm a big fan of GitHub's pull request system, and I think it's a great model for code review. It's not the be-all, end-all. It has its own warts that we've improved ourselves through some internal browser extensions and whatnot. But it really gives us a good way to keep track of comments. So what problems does code review solve? There are 2 of them. And it's pretty clear that the primary goal of code review is to find defects before they get into production, before customers are coming calling about them. However, there are 2 human problems that code review solves. The first of which is mental model synchronization. You've got 5 people on your team. Do you think that all of them have the exact same concept of what you're doing? Very unlikely not. Hopefully they're all similar if you're all on the same page, but code review is a great tool for making sure that these people are on the same page. It reduces the feedback cycle so that people can keep their mental model in synchronization with the rest of their team and with the architecture as written, especially as the architecture changes over time. With that in mind, they're best equipped to be able to mindfully implement the architecture as written and provide feedback on its design to improve it over time. Second of all, code review solves tribal knowledge, the process of tribal knowledge development. Code review is an excellent way to develop and keep alive this tribal knowledge, something that Grady talked about a little bit earlier. Tribal knowledge is the sum of stories of what was tried and what failed, how best to handle certain problems that are commonly faced when developing a project, what problems were faced as things came to be the way they are today, this concept of how things came to be this way, if there's any Ishmael fans out there. Part of this is called architectural oral history. Architectural oral history collapses without a team to keep the culture alive, says Michael Keeling, who's probably somewhere out in the room. Code review, or more specifically, code review systems enable a major part of that oral history to be written down, serving as a reference point or even a starting point for documenting the change of the architecture and the implementation over time. The most useful review systems will make comments searchable for posterity and encourage reviewers to extract actionable items directly in context. Say, hey, we should do this. Click the button, new issue. Now you have record that we should do this. And it's done so in an actionable, trackable way. So code review forces us to write it down and to make it searchable. Next, let's talk about 3 specific quality attributes and some related attributes that code review ensures, at least in my book. If you value these quality attributes in your architecture, then you should definitely be doing code review. When authors move on from a project, who's going to care for it? People are not forever. They move on, they move up, they quit, they win the lottery, we say. Neither are their minds forever. People don't keep their minds intact. They might forget what they did after a couple months, days, hours. So it's vital that an architecture values maintainability. So we'll talk about that first. To me, valuing maintainability in an architecture necessitates that engineers write maintainable code that is picked up easily and modified quickly by new developers, and has a design design that is easy for non-programmers to understand. Code review drives all of these. The best way to get somebody acquainted with code is to just throw them into it. Not necessarily in the please go make this change, but why don't you sit with me as I review somebody else's code, and we can see what they're making changes to and how they're making changes. Kind of the apprenticeship type way of doing things. We want them to learn the conventions and the patterns used in the code base and how the code uses the concepts of the language and the frameworks that have been chosen to supplement the language. We want both the initial developers and the maintenance mode crew to understand the goals of the architecture and the risks present in the code as it exists today. With this knowledge, they can deal with the problems on their own terms. We want them to use the same terminology as well, because establishing that vocabulary is absolutely necessary to make the project learnable. This chart shows the modalities for learning in a reviewing situation. I'm pulling this a little bit out of my education background. Pairing is great, but we need to spend just as much time reviewing in order to transfer knowledge to the next generation of engineers. We need to read solid code, and we need to read code that needs to be improved. We need to point out problems to solidify problem code and have our misunderstandings, our type 1 false positives, corrected by others who disagree with us in order to correct our own knowledge of whatever it is we're working on. And that next generation of younger engineers doesn't necessarily mean younger engineers. It could just be the guy who's taking over for you when you go work on something cooler. It's vital to ensure that developers on a project understand the architecture. It goes without saying almost. And the implementation decisions alike. They need to understand the code. While they may not be involved in the construction of each decision, code review enables them to be aware of the changes and ask questions about those changes as the project evolves. In doing so, they better understand the architecture and the implementation and are better equipped to identify not only the undesirable, but also the desirable deviations from the established plan and best practice. This builds tribal knowledge ripe for passing to others, including to executives and investors in that proverbial elevator. Serviceability focuses on the ability of a technical support team to provide that support. By exposing new configuration, hiding unnecessary and debugging configuration, and agreeing on some use cases that fall outside of the primary usage of the product, code review drives a consensus on what the people supporting the project will be expected to know and to do, so they can hire. This also, as a side effect, and I know my chief documentarian would slap me for saying this, but it drives documentation too. Linus's law applies here. Problems are more likely to be seen if more people are looking at the source of the problem. So to me, a code review ensures maintainability by encouraging engineers to write code that meets a consensus agreement on maintainability. Code that can be modified quickly, can be easily picked up by new developers, and is easy for non-programmers to understand. These quality attributes are all intertwined as well. Systems that are serviceable are understandable. Systems that are understandable are learnable. My first programming job out of school was at a business-to-business imprinting company. probably the most amenity thing that we had was Subversion for version control. We didn't really do anything else that was sensible, the things that we would assume are the standard practice these days. I didn't have to deal with production bugs because the company didn't want us to work outside of business hours. The rare outages that we had were the responsibility of the tech lead. But he wasn't reviewing any of the code as it was coming into the code base. We would make a change, he would have no idea what it was about. He'd just be like, great, you did that thing. Go off and do this other thing. So anytime there was an outage, it would take a really long time to resolve it because he had to go through the code and the changes to figure out what all had changed. The lack of code review in this company was obviously a problem. Those outages were rare because we wrote good code, but they were caused by generally entirely avoidable, obvious errors that were spotted after hours of poring over code. A few months after I left, one guy cost the company thousands of dollars in lost sales because he left his own email address hard-coded in a new subsystem instead of using the prescribed environment variable. This mistake was in place for 4 months. Of course, he was fired, despite this being literally his first and only mistake on the job in 3 years. One that could have very easily been prevented by a simple code review. Secondly, on our list of 3 quality attributes, code review ensures compliance. You have more than one person on your team knowledgeable about like Section 508, WAS, ARIA, internationalization, globalization, all those levelization things. Code review not only aids in compliance in those spheres through an expert reviewing the information, but it can also teach best practice, thereby expanding the number of people who write code with accessibility in mind. Code review drives auditability. Version control shows what changed and the reason for the change, but it doesn't show the decisions that were dropped. Just like we say, history is written by the victor, well, git commit history is written by the victorious commit. Idiomaticity, there's a new word for you, is the quality of using tools chosen for the project in the best way they were meant to be used. Ever seen Java that looked like C or Lisp littered with lots of Java in your Scala? These are violations of the idioms that the language prescribes. Idiom violations make for less readable code and in some cases less performant code. Writing that idiomatic code can often lead to better performance because the compiler is better able to handle that idiomatic code. My second job out of school was a consulting job. I was generally the only guy working on projects, sometimes with a couple of others, and oftentimes the only one in the room who really knew what was going on when I was working at customer sites. The lack of control and review for that cost us a lot of time and effort. We duplicated situations, duplicated code, from customers, technical people messing with the things that we had done and then not owning up to it, to not having an audit trail or a second set of eyes leading to a compromised system at a government agency. Of course, we didn't have any evidence it had actually been exploited. It was interesting. My first professional code review experience was this formal inspection, as I would come later to understand what it was. It was incredibly painful. I was the only expert in the room, and often the guy kind of sitting in the back saying, no, you're doing that wrong. No, you're doing that wrong. And they would ignore me because, well, I was the subcontractor. It kind of felt like this. Those of you, Grady talked about the guy that collects all the paintings. This is from that. Everyone wanted to get ahead in that situation. Incentives weren't aligned. Employees got overtime, even despite already having huge salaries, and the subcontractors were generally the ones who just got shit on all the time. It was very expensive, very, very expensive for this one meeting per week where we went over everything. And in general, it was not a positive experience, and we had a lot of missed opportunities. Generally, the accessibility expert in the room was the one who was doing the most talking, followed by the project manager. And These two people could have been doing this asynchronously with input from the rest of us as time went on. The project behind, because too many people could say no. Anybody in the room could say no to a change, and it would have to go back to almost back to the drawing board. Not necessarily, but you know what I mean. Thirdly, a code review ensures security. We want to spot vulnerabilities before they ship and teach a defensive posture. So Linus's law applies here too. More eyes on it, the more likely you're going to catch problems. But the best way to keep out bugs and vulnerabilities is to have somebody call you out on adding something that's not necessary yet. Yagni, you ain't going to need it. In this situation, reviewers are like your lawyer. You know, that person that you run things by whenever you think you're about to do something stupid, and then he confirms to say, yeah, that's stupid, don't do that. Next, some quick tips. We've got just a little bit of time left. When should you integrate code review into your architecture? 2 places. Because of the structure of an architecture eventually mirrors that of a developing organization, Conway's law, it's vital that an architecture include code review not only as a technical requirement at the same level of choice as a language stack or framework stack, but also as a project requirement that mandates and describes how members of the project's development team are expected to interact. This way, folks are able to provide feedback and strengthen not only the end result, the end product, but also the architecture that describes it. According to the book, The Best Kept Secrets of Code Review, a case study at Cisco Systems found that there was negligible difference in the number of defects found in a formal setting, such as an inspection, versus informally, such as what we do. For example, informal reviews are also faster and more cost efficient, especially through a model like GitHub. The ideal review size shouldn't exceed 400 lines of code changed. I have personal experience with this as someone who has regularly dropped 800,000 line commits. I know, bad. So here's some gross tips. Code review should occupy units of work. That is, if your team is using story points or some other system to estimate effort necessary to complete a task, make sure that you estimate the time necessary to do code reviews just as a part of that. My team uses a Fibonacci story point system, so most of our reviews are 1 or 2 points. If it's a big change, like one of my 1,000-line commit changes, then that's going to generate some controversy, and we want to bump that up to maybe a 3 or a 5. Accept that not everything is perfect. A good code review system will enable reviewers and submitters to create new work items quickly and easily, just as I stated earlier. Identify areas of the code that see a lot of change. We call that churn. There's a whole field of study related to churn in code, so don't get too deep down that rabbit hole. It's also important not to be petty. Keeping it professional and learning when to speak in person or through teleconference is incredibly valuable. You don't want to continue to bicker electronically unless you have a really solid reason to do so, such as showing code or giving links that you can't simply speak. Most of all, make progress. Don't let reviews slow down development unnecessarily. When reviews get backlogged, dogpile them. Say, everybody, go work on reviews. No new development until the reviews are done. Some of the major things that we look for, I really have to stress automation in this. My team recently put in more automatic style confirmation testing. We're writing in Scala, so we're using Scala check for that. That has solved most of our arguments and gotten rid of most of the reasons that we reject code and say, hey, fix this white space because it burns us. Lots of Gollum references there. But most importantly, of course, does it work and is it tested? We don't want to take on debt of code that's not tested. Lastly, let's talk about some of the limitations of code review. Code review cannot easily expose how code changes, affect the runtime environment. A reviewer is certainly encouraged to download and run the code, but we don't want to do this too often because we'll simply get behind time. It takes a lot of time to do that. Reviewers must learn when to communicate person to person instead of continuing a typewritten conversation, as I said earlier. Drawn out electronic conversation, even if it's not heated, is extremely time consuming and should really only occur when code examples or hyperlinks are necessary to understand the comments. But most of all, code review cannot solve political problems. Code review will not magically get your boss off of you. It will not stop QA from knocking at your doorstep, and it won't stop layoffs. In fact, code review can be a barrier to one's ownership of their own contributions. A reviewer with an agenda could effectively block a submitter and steal or rewrite their work, such as what Julianne Horvath described as a part of her reason for leaving GitHub and filing lawsuits alleging sexism in the company. She held that a coworker that she snubbed romantically blocked her work and wasted time altering it needlessly. I would work on something, go to bed, and wake up to find my work gone without explanation, she said, publicly. A counter to this specific problem: ensure that no one reviewer is a bottleneck, that no one reviewer is a gateway for any other reviewer's code. Everybody reviews, everybody writes. So that's about it. We talked about the definition of code review. We talked about the problems that code review solves and the primary quality attributes that code review ensures. We reviewed some of my tips, suggestions, and some caveats about how best to do code review. And that's basically it. I do have to do a shameless plug for a conference that I'm organizing in August. Please check it out. I'm Colin Dean.